Sunday, the 9th of October, 1893. 5 o'clock. I came to Dunkelheit Manor to finally meet the Count and Charlotte's family. The moment I had arrived, I was escorted by a maid to the back of the estate to see Charlotte's brother, Jean-Paul, fencing, with whom I could only assume was her father. He was a very handsome and tall fellow, with a piercing blue eye and nice, soft-looking, fair hair. As she had warned me, he wore an eye patch, so I did my best not to stare or focus on it. He moved very agile and was far better than Jean-Paul, who was a bit slow, but it could be more from a lack of interest than lack of talent. Sitting at a table in front of me was Miss Charlotte Dunkelheit, her nose in a book and an agitated expression on her face. She looked as though she'd rather be anywhere else.
Ah!
I heard Jean-Paul call out.
Charlotte, we have a guest. Do greet him, please.
Charlotte abruptly gave a look of disdain and glared at me with contempt after doing so to her brother. But the look wasn't at me, it was at the situation. She then cleared her throat and began to speak.
Good afternoon, Mordecai.
She then looked back into her book.
Since I was so rudely interrupted, I might as well greet him, thank you very much. I think maybe I should take my leave so you men can have your fun with the fencing and mine with my book.
She stood up fiercely, ready to leave.
Charlotte!
Jean-Paul tried to say, but was immediately stabbed in the chest by the Count's sabre.
Hey!
But the Count ignored his son's cry and turned towards me.
The profound Mr. Blackwood has finally come to grace my manor.
It almost felt as though he was mocking me and making some sort of jape. He picked up the second sabre and made intense eye contact with me.
Tell me, do you fence?
Actually, I responded in a bit of confusion, I used to do it professionally. As a matter of fact...
Perfect.
He threw the sabre to me and I caught it just as fast as he tossed.
I'm sure you'll fare a better sparring partner than my son. You've proved to have better reflexes already. I'll let you ready yourself first, of course.
Okay. I was in a state of puzzlement at first, but I thought I would play along. It had been a while since I had fenced, so it actually sounded like fun. Charlotte stiffened up a bit behind me and sat back down in a chair as Jean-Paul wandered over to the table, rubbing his shoulder where he had just been stabbed. The Count and I had some good matches, seeming to be equally matched, but I almost felt as though he was holding back, which was disappointing to me, although I couldn't help to notice how potently Charlotte had been watching us. After a few matches, I brought myself to ask, Miss Dunkelheit, do you know how to fence too? She turned bright red and seemed flabbergasted as she brashly replied.
What? Oh no, sir, I don't fence.
Jean-Paul quickly added,
It would hardly be proper, anyway.
He looked away with embarrassment and guilt on his face. The Count crocked an eyebrow and coyly questioned.
Don't do it, but not don't know how. Right, Jean-Paul?
How do you...
Of course I know you taught her how. Come, Charlotte, you're next.
She began to panic and countered with,
You want me to fence against you? I hardly think that's a good idea. I mean, I haven't fenced since I was 10 and...
Now, I'll have no excuses.
He immediately approached Charlotte and pulled her along with him to center stage.
Allow me to teach you more. I know you are a perfectionist, so I'll help you on your way to excel in this. Just like archery and jockey training.
He turned towards me.
Mr. Blackwood will be your opponent, but I'll just be your guide.
She looked as stiff as a board and a sickly nervous look was pasted to her face.
First, let's get you into a good stance.
He initially had begun until he realized her posture and instead insisted,
Actually, you need to loosen up a bit before that. You're much too tense.
The Count eventually got her to lose her strain and helped her get a few jabs and movements in. When he felt she was ready to face someone on her own, she said she was quite comfortable with the idea of fencing either of us. He laughed and remarked that Jean-Paul might be a better opponent, as she would undoubtedly win against him. He threw his father a sour face as the man laughed at his own jape. He let Charlotte be, not insisting she fight anyone, and she tried her best to smile and laugh along as well, but more so at the situation than his unsavory comment. And in that moment, whilst the Count chuckled and Charlotte was giggling, I took notice of the inside of his mouth. I ended up being the one to stiffen this time. What an unsavory sight. Did he fancy himself a shark, and this was an extent to the creature that my companion has tried claiming they are? As we headed inside, I quietly whispered to Charlotte, So, I have a question about your father. You see, I just realized that his teeth, well, Is that? She immediately caught on to what I was trying to ask, and responded with,
Oh, yes, his teeth are pointed. He filed them. Inspired by the ancient Mayans, I believe.
All right. Now that was harrowing and ghastly and far from normal. Why on earth would he file his teeth to look like a shark? Charlotte, however, seemed to pick up on my unease.
Oh, just ignore him. If he gives you any coy smiles or looks, he's only doing it to bother you. My Vata likes to get under people's skin, especially if he perceives you as a threat. He just wants to remind you not to step out of line with me.
At one point, Charlotte snuck away with me to show off her room. As we entered, she snidely went up to a painting on the wall and removed it, flinging her arms to a now empty space with a
Ta-da!
Though her facial expression was rather unamused. I stared blankly for a moment, realizing there was a blackish spot, but I was still at a loss. I said, I think I'm missing something. It appears that you're trying to show me a wall with a mark.
It's a filled-in peephole.
Her voice was so matter-of-fact, but my skin began to crawl at this new information. That is mortifying!
Yes, well, it's unusable now. It was filled in sometime around me being 12, I believe. I suppose right around the time I was reaching womanhood.
There really shouldn't be a peephole in anyone's room in the first place. Especially for a young lady. I find it almost all the more disturbing that it was present while you were still just a young girl.
I don't believe it ever got used. I think I would have noticed. It was there just in case when I was finally mature enough. But I suppose there was some sort of change of heart or realization.
When did you first notice it existed? She shrugged her shoulders.
Anyway, before my Vati gets too suspicious, we should probably head back down.
She stood up and retrieved something from her desk.
If he asks, just tell him I was trying to grab this for you before I forgot later.
She handed me a thin stack of papers that seemed to have compositions and sheet music scribbled across them.
For you to overlook, of course.
Charlotte almost seemed flushed and embarrassed, and I suppose I would realize after I actually read the contents of her work. I followed her back down to the parlor and she reunited with her family. However, something about the imagery in front of me just didn't seem right. I took a second glance and realized what was off. The Count had no shadow. Charlotte and Jean-Paul were in the same line of sight, and their shadows were present. Even the table with a potted plant that put the Count between it and them had its dark copy. But he had none. He pulled out his hanky for a moment, and it seemed to carelessly fall through his fingers and onto the floor. He simply gave a roll of his eye for this, as he stood in place, unfazed by the tedious scenario. Suddenly, I saw the item lift up towards him without him needing to move a muscle. I looked back at the wall behind the Count, watching what appeared to be his shadowing pick up the handkerchief shadow, lifting it up until it was nearly in his hand. The Count didn't move his head, but his one blue eye caught wind of my observation and stared right back at me. He gave out a sickly grin and asked,
Something troubling you, Herr Blackwood?
I shook my head. I knew this was another one of his intimidation games. His shadow was moving on its own accord as though it was an entirely separate entity from his being. I assume he normally wouldn't show this side of himself off to most people, so it truly must have felt the need to intimidate me. I suppose this makes Charlotte's story of being able to lose her head at the removal of her choker all the more believable, given the unbelievable sight in front of me. I was under the impression that he knew something, and that was why he was playing all his cards, though I doubt he would admit to it. It was as Charlotte said. He wanted me to know my place and not to cross any boundaries. I was a threat to his daughter, as any gentleman who was spending copious amounts of time alone with a young lady would be seen. There wasn't too much more that happened in regards to our activities. The Count extended an invite to stay to dinner, but it felt more like a rehearsed common courtesy than an actual interest. I'm also pretty confident that Jean-Paul was there simply to make sure things didn't go awry and to calm Charlotte's nerves, so he was incredibly eager to leave as well. Before making my departure, the Count had finally made physical contact with me, bringing me in for a rather firm handshake. He had said,
It was a pleasure, Mr. Blackwood. I am relieved to finally meet the man that Charlotte frequents and personally thank him for his protection of my youngest child. However, gratitude and feeling of indebtedness can run out.
He had a rather malicious grin on his lips and a dared look in his eye. After I got home, I kept thinking on this. There was something strange I had noticed about the Count's way of speaking. Something about it was almost farce. Now, that isn't me saying he had a fake German accent, but there was something strange I found in his speech pattern. One moment, his English was off and not the best, which only made sense, seeing as he came from Germany and did indeed have an accent. But then suddenly, his English was perfect and completely flawless, better than most Englishmen. And he would still have his accent, but it was strange that he would have such an enormous improvement so suddenly. I tried not to overthink it, but it hasn't left my head yet. Charlotte has brought up that he is a liar. Perhaps he only feigns his bad grammar to come off as meek and innocent. But after seeing those teeth of his, I'm beginning to slightly understand the kind of man I am dealing with. I used to say that Signora Abello had a toothy grin full of misdeeds and lies. I have a feeling the two aren't very different. Or worse, they are incredibly different. Just that Signora Abello couldn't hold up a candle to how much more the Count's misdeeds are.